Welcome to Election Night 2020 from Dartmouth College and the Rockefeller Center. We've invited small groups of students to various locations around the campus and to rooms here at the Rockefeller Center. We also have viewing stations at the Collis Commons and tents in front of Streeter, Wheeler, and Cutter Shabazz. I should say that we have been vacant. Most of these places have been vacant most of the term, and it's good to have students back, even if for just one evening. And many others are joining us from the evening. Welcome to all of you as well. Elections are the cornerstone of our democracy. Thank you for your interest and thank you for participating. Please keep it up beyond this evening. No matter what happens, whether your preferred candidate wins or loses, or even if we can't determine a winner for as long as it takes to resolve the election, let us all be thankful for the opportunity we have to provide input into the political system and to come together, much like the spirit of Nelson Rockefeller, someone who transcended political parties to provide a model of leadership and public policy. And he saw results for the people he served. Tonight, it is a pleasure to welcome two individuals who have deep experience with the presidential elections. I'm going to start with Justin Anderson, and he in turn will introduce Chip Reid. Justin Anderson is Dartmouth's Vice President for Communications. He heads the Office of Communications and is a member of President Hanlon's senior leadership team. Justin came to Dartmouth from ABC News to work as the college's Director of Media Relations. Justin has experience covering presidential races as a journalist himself. In the past, in particular, he has covered John McCain's presidential campaign in the year 2000, as well as serving as the coordinator for ABC's coverage of the 2008 presidential election. Many at Dartmouth know him as the moderator for the Provost's bi-weekly Community Conversations series with Joe Helbley, who's challenged us to find ways to gather students together in small settings like this one. So we're very happy to have Justin participate here. Today we're going to go back to Justin's origins and expertise in journalism, and Justin will introduce our main speaker tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that very nice introduction. It is so nice to be with all of you this evening. Election days, election nights are always exciting, and today is certainly no different. Perhaps a little bit more stressful than usual. So it's nice to be able to come together in a group as we are excited and stressful, and can hopefully share that emotion together. It is my pleasure to introduce Chip Reid. Chip is national correspondent for CBS News in Washington, D.C. He has a long and illustrious career at all three broadcast networks. But from 2009 to 2011, he was CBS News' chief White House correspondent. And during that time, he interviewed President Obama multiple times. Before joining CBS, Chip reported from NBC News and my alma mater, ABC News, and before that, two local Washington, D.C. stations. He has covered multiple presidential campaigns, which I'm sure we're going to hear more about shortly. Chip has reported extensively around the world, including from the Middle East. He reported from Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. In 2003, he was embedded with U.S. Marines for the first 6 weeks of the Iraq War. And if that wasn't impressive enough, prior to his journalism career, Chip practiced law, serving for 4 years as counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee on the staff of ranking Democrat Joe Biden. And in 1987, he was general counsel to Joe Biden's first presidential campaign. So Chip, it's great to have you here. I will turn it over to you right now. Welcome to Dartmouth.
Well, thank you very much. Let me, in the interest of full disclosure here, as you just heard, I worked for one of these presidential candidates. And one reason that I am available tonight I am not very technical. Sorry, guys. I just realized I was muted. You hear me now? I hope you do.
We can hear you, Chip.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, in full disclosure, I wanted to make clear that the reason I'm available tonight and not out covering this campaign is because when Joe Biden became the front runner, I bowed out of this campaign. I still cover, I fill in at the White House, but I've been following it very, very closely, but I just thought there was too much of the appearance of a conflict of interest for somebody who had worked for Joe Biden's for almost 6 years back in the 1980s, a long time ago, but I take the conflict of interest thing very seriously. Given that one of the things I did for Joe Biden as a lawyer was determine who had a conflict of interest and who didn't. So I take it seriously. But anyway, thank you very much for inviting me here. I always take the position that it's my goal to put my personal views aside, which is what I did when I covered the White House and Joe Biden was the vice president. Whenever there was a Joe Biden story, I would give it to Bill Plant, who was the other White House correspondent at the time. My views when I'm reporting are irrelevant, my personal views. So it's something I've worked very hard at over the last 32 years. And I hope I can stick to that tonight too. But thank you very much for inviting me. Let me begin by saying the questions that I assigned myself here are, and I almost wish I had picked something easier because political predictions are so often wrong these days. But the questions are, first, what would a Joe Biden victory mean? And second, what would a Donald Trump victory mean? Now, first, before I address those questions, I want to go back for a moment to 2016 when my assignment on Election Day for CBS News was to cover Wisconsin. And you may wonder, if you cover politics, what the hell was I doing in Wisconsin? Because Wisconsin wasn't even believed to be a battleground state on election night. Well, that changed. It sounded like a bit of a boondoggle. The reason I was in Wisconsin was to interview Paul Ryan, the then Speaker of the House, about how he was going to deal with President Hillary Clinton, because of course everybody thought Hillary Clinton was going to be president. Well, late in the evening on Election Day 2016, and much to my surprise and pretty much to everybody's surprise, Wisconsin suddenly became not only a battleground state, but one of the three key battleground states that put Donald Trump over the top. Now, 4 years later, all the polls are saying that Joe Biden is going to win. So the first answer to the question, what would a Joe Biden victory mean, is that the pollsters and the experts finally got one right, if that happens. Their reputation is so on the line this time around. If they get it wrong this time, I don't know how they're going to recover. They might never recover. I don't know if anybody's ever going to believe the experts and the pollsters again. Charlie Cook, who is one of the best prognosticators in this business, you may know him, people who follow politics, wrote a piece today that basically said the only question left is how big is Joe Biden's margin of victory going to be? He really went out on a limb, but he's done it before and he's been right in the past. So if Joe Biden doesn't win, Charlie Cook and a whole lot of other so-called experts are not just going to be wearing surgical masks for the foreseeable future. They're going to be wearing their Halloween masks because they're not going to want anybody to be able to recognize them. So what would it mean for Joe Biden? Usually when you talk about what an election is going to mean for a candidate, you're talking about policy. And I will get to that. But there's so much else before we even get to policy. These are just not normal times. So let's start with the short term. And I hate to say it, but I think one of the very first things that's going to happen if Joe Biden wins is social unrest. I'm sure we've all seen the video of the trucks with the pickup trucks and SUVs and other vehicles with their Trump flags waving on the highway in Texas. As they surrounded and slowed down and terrified people on board, I know that for a fact, a Biden campaign bus. Other things similar to that have happened in New Jersey and in other states. And I tell you, in 32 years in this business, I've never seen anybody who can fire up supporters and incite passions, both pro and con, as Donald Trump can do. I think it's probably a pretty good guess that if Donald Trump is projected to lose tonight or in the next day or two, he will go before the cameras and call it a rigged election. And there will be plenty of people who believe him. In some states, police departments are already keeping an eye on local militia groups for possible violence if Trump does not win. Now, one of the big worries in this whole thing, some of you may have come across this, is this red mirage, blue wave scenario. That refers to the possibility that early returns will show a red mirage, as they're calling it, as some people are calling it, that returns in some battleground states will favor President Trump because the people who vote today are mostly Republicans, and those votes get counted first. So it's going to look like Trump's doing well, and there have been reports that if that happens, President Trump is going to come out and he's going to declare victory. The problem is that most Democrats voted early, most of them by mail. So if it's a close election, it's possible that a Trump lead could turn into a so-called red mirage that would then be gradually overwhelmed by a blue wave in the coming days as the mail-in ballots are counted. And if that happens, I think it's a pretty good guess that Trump will insist the election is rigged, and that could really fire up some of his supporters. And I shudder to think what could happen if that red mirage, blue wave scenario actually does happen. Now, 20 years ago, I covered the 2000 election, including the entire Florida recount. It was tense, it was contentious, at times it was angry, but I don't remember ever thinking or reporting that fear of violence was one of the major concerns, but it is today. What else would a Biden victory mean? Well, still focusing on the short term, it means Donald Trump will be a lame duck president until January 20th. That's, I believe, 77 days from now. That's a lot of time to shake things up, and he, of course, is very good at shaking things up. One of the favorite guessing games here in Washington these days is, what will Trump do during that lame duck period if he loses? Will he fire everyone he perceives as being disloyal, including the director of the FBI, the defense secretary, maybe even Anthony Fauci, if he can find a legal way to fire a long-term government employee? And how about the power to pardon? Bill Clinton caused an uproar by pardoning 140 people at the end of his time in office, right at the, I believe they were all on the last day. Some people think that will look like small potatoes compared to what Trump would do in a similar circumstance. The big question, of course, is whether he can pardon himself. Probably not, but it's going to be a battle. Looking a bit more long-term, a Biden victory would also mean a crackdown on COVID-19. And that's going to require getting people to change their behavior. And a lot of people are going to object to that and shut down their businesses, and people are going to object to that. And you can bet the pushback on all of that is going to be significant. Finally, what will a Biden victory mean on the policy front? The answer, a lot. And by the way, I want to make clear that I am not speaking, even though I worked for Biden for 6 years in the 1980s, I do not have inside information. When I pulled myself out of covering this campaign, I also disconnected from anybody on the Biden campaign. But I do know the guy, and I know a lot of the people who work there, and I have a pretty good idea of what they think. But what will it mean on the policy front? A lot. It really is a lot, because I know that we all know Joe Biden is the ultimate Washington insider. And he has scores and scores of people who worked for him or for President Obama in the White House, who worked for him in the Senate over all those years. And they are putting together, and have been for months, putting together detailed plans. I mean, this is widely reported, detailed plans on everything from immigration to foreign policy, to healthcare, to taxes, to the environment. So if Biden does win, and especially if Democrats take the Senate, he'll be able to really hit the ground running. And I think he will be able to have an enormously successful first 100 days on all of those issues and others. He will also be able to reverse many of the environmental and business regulations that the Trump administration has eliminated or significantly modified. So I think it's going to be a very busy time, and especially, of course if the Democrats take over the Senate. As Charlie Cook predicted today, he predicted that they would have a majority of 52. So one big question, though, is what will Biden do? Will he steer hard to the left to keep Elizabeth Warren and Bernie and their supporters happy? Or will he steer hard to the middle, where he has occupied space for most of his career? I think it's pretty clear just from things he's said, what he's done so far, it's going to be right smack dab in the middle of all that. He feels very comfortable trying to get as big a coalition as he can and working with people from all sides. I think he'll also make an effort to get Republicans involved. But how do you get Republicans to vote for legislation that is also being supported by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders? Very, very tough task, but he will try. I'm not sure he will be successful, but I think he will be somewhere right in the middle of the Republican Party rather than steering to Bernie's side or to a moderate Democrat, moderate Republican side. So, okay, part two, what would a Trump victory mean? Well, just as with Biden, I think one of the first effects, unfortunately, will be social unrest, perhaps even worse. We saw it after the death of George Floyd. We saw peaceful protests that turned violent because there are, I don't know what word you want to use, agitators, whatever, people who just take advantage of situations like that to loot, to set fires. And there will be a lot of angry people. I don't know what it's like in the political hotbed of Hanover, New Hampshire right now, but here in Washington, I'm sitting in a building, the CBS headquarters, that is completely boarded up outside. There are hundreds of buildings in Washington that are boarded up. They were boarded up during the George Floyd protests, and they're boarded up again, only more so. People are really afraid that this is going to end up in violence if President Trump wins in big cities. I think most of the trouble if Joe Biden wins will be outside of cities, but who knows? It's pretty scary. I personally wake up in the middle of the night sometimes thinking of all the things that could happen, whichever way it goes. But especially after the polls showing that Joe Biden is almost a cinch to win, for President Trump to win, I think it's going to be even more of a shock than it was, a good deal more of a shock than it was back in 2016 to his critics. I think the vast majority, again, of the protesters will be peaceful, but it doesn't take many to, and I fault the news business for this to a large degree, it doesn't take many to get burning cars on TV and give the impression that the violence is much more widespread than it really is. As for Trump himself, he will, of course, feel emboldened if he wins. He will feel more free to do as he pleases. I'm sure we all remember when President Trump said that Article 2 of the Constitution gives him total authority. I would not be surprised if there's more of that kind of talk, and even more so. He recently started moving on a plan. Not clear if he can do it, but he's certainly going to try to give him the power to fire anybody in the federal government who he wants to fire. Loyalty will become the coin of the realm even more than it already is. As for policy, it's a bit of a mystery. He didn't really run on a set of policies or on a platform. He didn't really present a policy platform at the Republican convention. As limited as it was. And of course, if the House remains in Democratic hands, and if the Senate goes Democratic, there will be almost total gridlock on Capitol Hill. There just won't be much done at all. In that case, of course, he'll continue to focus on things he can do without Congress, cracking down on immigration, eliminating regulations, issuing executive orders. A lot of it will be fought out in the courts. On the issue of judges, of course, it depends on whether the Senate remains in Republican hands. If it does, then he will be able to increase his astounding number of judges who he has appointed so far. And keep in mind, hate to put it this way, but Justice Stephen Breyer is 82 years old. And it's well known that conservative groups in DC already have a list of people they would like to replace him. That would give conservatives a 7-2 majority on the court. But again, that can only happen if President Trump is reelected and if Republicans maintain control of the Senate. On COVID, I think it's clear he will continue to downplay it. It seems to be just part of him. It's not something that he wants to fight. He said recently, we're, quote, learning to live with it, to which Joe Biden responded, we're learning to die with it. But Trump will, in all likelihood, continue to argue that it is what it is, as he put it, and do everything he can to reopen the nation. Will that make the coronavirus pandemic worse? I don't think there's any doubt. But that seems to be a risk he's willing to take in return for opening the economy. Finally, here's an issue a lot of people don't talk about. There's the issue of the Trump family dynasty. When I cover Trump rallies, there are always some people in the crowd who are wearing T-shirts that say Donald Trump 2020, Donald Trump Jr. 2024, Ivanka Trump 2032, Eric Trump 2040. And they are serious. They really believe that this is just the beginning of a family dynasty. I'm not saying it's a majority Republican opinion or even a majority of the people at the rallies, but there are enough people, from people I've talked to at these rallies, there are enough people who believe it, that it really will be an issue if he gets reelected. The last question I assigned myself for this webinar was, is this election a turning point in American history? And my answer is very brief. I believe it's pretty clear that the answer to that is duh. So that is all I have to say. It's shorter than they asked me to do, so that leaves more time for questions. So I am all ears.
That is great, Chip. I'm glad to hear that you're all ears, because we will have questions for you soon, but I'm going to take the classic moderator's prerogative to ask you the first couple of questions.
Okay.
Given the question that you just posed yourself about whether or not this election is a turning point, and I guess even more specifically, your very concise answer, I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I want to tease out that a little bit. We hear often that 2020 is an election like no other, and it certainly feels that way. It's safe to say for our students out there who are watching, it certainly is, if only because they haven't lived through too many elections yet. Nevertheless, if you take the longer view, are the stakes as high today as, say, in 2004, right after 9/11, or going back to 1932 when the Depression was the backdrop for the election? And, needless to say, 1860 was a pretty big year in American history, and that was a big election when Lincoln won. So is this an election like no other? Is this a turning point? You think so? Yes. So could you perhaps expand on that as you put it in a historical context?
Yeah, well, I think there have been a number of elections that have been turning points, and I am not a professional historian, but I certainly think Roosevelt was a turning point. I think Ronald Reagan was a turning point. Certainly there were elections in the 1800s, the early years of Jefferson and Adams and Madison that were turning points, and Jackson. I mean, there have been certainly Lincoln and after Lincoln, but real turning points are fairly few. I think that this is one of those. I mean, who knows? We could turn out to be wrong because it all depends on what happens after this. If Biden wins this time and Donald Trump Jr. men are so, their goals are so dramatically different. You will hear tremendous amount of talk from Joe Biden about unifying the nation, about bringing people together. That's going to be really hard to do because, as I mentioned, it's going to be almost impossible to get any Republicans on legislation that is supported by Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, which of course is going to be the goal. So I think Biden's going to be disappointed in the amount of bringing the nation together that he can do, but he will be relentless on doing that. Donald Trump will not, clearly. So I do think it's a turning point, but I could certainly be proven wrong if we. I mean, almost every year they say, "Oh, this one's a turning point. That one's a turning point." 2000 felt like a turning point, was it? In some ways it was, but I don't think you can compare it to Reagan or FDR or the Civil War elections.
Chip, one more question from me before we go around the horn to some of our students who are watching from around campus. And this one, I wanna really take advantage of your experience, not just as a journalist, but also as a lawyer. There's been a lot of talk about lawyers as it relates to the election outcome. And in fact, President Trump just said recently that when the polls close in Pennsylvania, he's going to bring in the lawyers. As we are contemplating the end of this extensively long voting period, are we transitioning now from electoral strategy to legal strategy? And what does that mean that President Trump is going to bring the lawyers into Pennsylvania? How are the both campaigns thinking about this?
Well, go back to 2000. It certainly went from an election strategy to a legal strategy. There was a lot of politics in it too, and a lot of public relations. But remember, it was the Supreme Court that determined that the recount should stop in Florida. It was, Democrats still believe to this day that if the recount had continued to the end, that Al Gore would have won. And it's one of the things that motivates them. I tell you, it was a couple months ago when the Biden campaign announced that they had a team of 600 lawyers, more than 600 lawyers across the nation. My guess is they have far more than that now to deal with all the different issues that could occur in all the different states. And it's, if this is a really close election, then certainly this could turn into an election dominated by legal strategy rather than political strategy, or at least largely legal strategy. But to get to your question, to the point of your question, I think that when Trump said that, and it's consistent with other things he has said, the real point he was making was that in his view, this is his Supreme Court. They've disappointed him at times, but he believes this is his Supreme Court. And he believes that if he can get this election before the Supreme Court, somehow or other, they will rule in his favor and he will win.
Wow, thanks, Chip. I think now let's go to some of our students. Start in Collis Common Grounds. You guys out there?
Hello. So my question is, how do you think the unprecedented amount of mail-in ballots are going to affect the results of this year's election?
Well, the first one is what I already talked about, the fact that the Democratic mail-in ballots in many states will be counted later. So it could mean that Trump could get an early lead, he could declare victory, and then over time it could become clear that Biden wins because of the mail-in ballots. But you also have all these problems with mail-in ballots. I mean, the good side for the Democrats of mail-in ballots is that it gets so many people to vote who might otherwise not vote. The downside is that far more mail-in ballots are tossed because of irregularities and errors than are tossed in-person voting. A lot of people have to vote, have to vote provisionally, and some of those will be thrown out. So it's something Democrats are worried about. You remember several weeks ago, there came a turning point when the Biden campaign was pushing very hard for everybody to vote by mail, to get as many people as possible voting early, get them, get those votes done. And then they started to realize that people were having trouble doing it, doing the forms absolutely correctly. I voted incorrectly in DC. It did get through, but they give you a little ballot envelope that the ballot doesn't fit in. And I didn't understand that you're supposed to just slide it in even though it doesn't fit completely. So my wife and I both said, what do we do? And we folded it in half and put it in. Wrongo bongo, you're not supposed to do that. But apparently they're letting that slide. But in some states, you make the slightest little error like that, and your ballot's gone. Your ballot is out. So it is a worry among Democrats now that in a really close state election, in one of the real battleground states, they worry that enough of these mail-in ballots could be thrown out because of errors to make a difference.
Chip, we're going to go to Rocky, and I'm going to ask you if you could repeat the question from the questioner, just to make sure everybody out there
got it.
Hear the question.
Okay.
So with that,
keep that question brief then.
Yeah. So let's go to Rocky right now for the next question.
Hi, my question is related to social media. We have examples of a lot of people between the ages of 18 and 25 predominantly that are extremely active in terms of promoting voting. Do you think that this is a reflection of people's behavior in real life, or is it more of just social media presence that is not really apparent in actual voting turnout?
Could you ask me that one more time? I missed it. It went out for a moment there.
Of course, yeah. Do you think that people's high levels of activities on social media is a reflection of their actual behavior in real life in terms of how many of them are actually voting versus how many of them are saying that people should vote?
Yeah, no, I don't have much faith that social media is a reflection of how people are going to vote and whether they're going to vote. I'm an old curmudgeon, and I do as little social media as I possibly can, because I kind of see it as a bit of a cesspool, especially Twitter. I call it, it's the world's center of misinformation and ugliness. But it's also necessary in a lot of ways. You can't really do your job in journalism without doing some social media. But no, I do not confuse the two. I do not believe that the fact that people between 18 and 25 are doing a lot of social media and expressing their opinions means they're going to vote. It hasn't in the past. I would love to be proven wrong. But no, I don't think there's a direct connection between social media use and how likely people are to vote. Did that answer your question? Oh, and I didn't repeat the question, did I? Her question, you give me an instruction and the first thing I do is ignore it. So her question was, do I believe that the high level of social media use by people 18 to 25 is an and in which they often express their views is an indication of how likely they are to vote? And I do not believe it is.
Let's go now back to Collis, where we have some members of the Student Assembly.
Hi, I'm Kami from the Student Assembly, and I'm wondering, what, if any, role will the conservative Supreme Court play if either campaign kind of like contests the results of the election?
Well, that question is, what, if any, role will the Supreme Court play if either side contests the election? I don't know. Can I ask what year you were born?
I was born in 2002.
So 2000 happened 2 years before you were born. Boy, that makes me feel old. But anyway, I mean, that was determined by the Supreme Court. And as I mentioned, it is still something many Democrats are bitter about to this day. They believe Al Gore would have won. They believe that George Bush would not have been president. They believe that 9/11 might have been avoided. They believe that a horrible recession might have been avoided. And they believe that the Iraq War would have been avoided if Al Gore had been. I mean, Democrats who went through that still believe to this day that it was a turning point of sorts, maybe not a historic turning point like Reagan or FDR, in my opinion, but it was certainly a turning point that led to some things happening over the next 8 years that Democrats think were disastrous. And that was the Supreme Court. And that was a more closely divided Supreme Court than this one. This one's a 6-3 court. So it is certainly conceivable. But I think one of the differences is, though, that many of the arguments that President Trump has used against mail-in voting, for example, and against extending deadlines in Pennsylvania for mail-in votes and things of that sort are not very controversial. They're things both Republicans and Democrats have been supporting for years. So, I mean, so far, I have not seen arguments that would be, in my opinion, that would be likely to be accepted by the Supreme Court. But we didn't know what the Supreme Court was going to rule on in the end in the year 2000 either. So it is certainly possible that the Supreme Court will have a role in this, and there are certainly both Democratic and Republican pundits out there who believe that if it does make it to the Supreme Court on something really significant, and if it's a really close election and gets down to one state, that it could make a difference. Thank you.
Chip, since we're talking about the Supreme Court, I'm going to jump in here and ask sort of a follow-up to what you were mentioning in your introduction. You were talking about what would happen if Joe Biden wins. I don't believe you said one of those things would be an expansion of the Supreme Court. That is something that has been talked about a lot, particularly in the wake of the Amy Coney Barrett first nomination and then confirmation. Knowing Joe Biden like you do, if he were to win, what do you think the chances of an expanded Supreme Court are?
You know, that's an interesting question in a way. I don't know if you've seen that clip on TV. I think it's run pretty widely, where Biden says it was a boneheaded idea when FDR suggested packing the Supreme Court, as they call it, expanding the size of the Supreme Court. Well, there's an aide, an advisor sitting behind Biden at that hearing, and it is I. I do not remember that moment, but if you look at that clip the next time it runs on TV, there's a very youthful guy with big hair sitting behind Joe Biden and looking around the room like he wasn't paying any attention, and it was me. It was I, if you want to be grammatically correct. And but I think there's no doubt he is inclined not to do that, and I have no reason to believe that he would do that. So I'm going beyond your question and saying the one thing, my guess is the one thing that could change his mind is if this court starts doing things like reversing the gay marriage decision, reversing Roe v. Wade, killing the Affordable Care Act, doing things of that sort, really dramatically changing the jurisprudence in this nation in a way that is highly political in the view of Democrats, and something that just enrages the entire Democratic establishment and left wing. If the court does something like that, then I could imagine him eventually changing his mind. I mean, Joe Biden did change his mind on Robert Bork. He was inclined initially back in 1987. That was after I left working for him. I'm giving my age away here. I worked for him from 82 to 86 in the Senate. And then I went back to work for him in 87, late in 87, to work on the campaign, but I did not work on the Bork campaign, on the Bork nomination. But Biden went into that saying that I don't think, and I know I had done judicial nominations for him, and he believed that you should not reject anybody on the basis of their ideology. But with Bork, he became convinced that his ideology was so extreme that in that case, he changed his mind, that you could consider and reject somebody on the basis of ideology. So could he change on this? I wouldn't rule it out completely anyway.
Yeah. Well, if it's any consolation, Chip, we all had big hair in the 80s. Let's go to Qatar Shabazz, where we have some of the college Democrats.
Hi, so my name is Jake, and I'm just wondering about, so early votes out of Florida show that Biden is dramatically underperforming in Miami-Dade, which means that the New York Times said Trump could win Florida. What are your thoughts on this, and is it representative of what we might see in the rest of the country tonight?
I don't know. I'm not much on the crystal ball stuff, but I do know that already the Biden campaign put out, I'm not sure how they put it out in a tweet or what, but somebody responded and said that, said something about, they said in Florida, it's still neck and neck, which is usually a political way of saying it's not looking good. But they also said that they're overperforming in Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So at least the position they're taking at this point is, even if they lose Florida, they're still feeling optimistic. But you know, Florida, there were some polls several weeks ago that showed Biden with a big lead then. But it's really been neck and neck. I don't think it will surprise anybody if either one of them wins Florida. And if Biden loses it, it is certainly not a death knell for his campaign.
And I would point out that it's 7:43 p.m. I think it's a little too early to call Florida for any early returns or no early returns. I think. Yeah. I think it's going to be hours before.
That is a very good point. Yeah, it's going to be quite a while.
So let's go to the Streeter tent, where we have the Dartmouth Political Union.
Hi. So one of the questions we were going to ask was whether you have any insider information with regards to Pennsylvania, but you answered that to some degree already. So our question would be, what race do you believe, whether it's a state or national or local, that is important but often overlooked this cycle, that could teach us something about American politics in the years to come?
Yeah, I read a really good piece on that today, and it was all about state houses across the country. And there are battles going on in a number of state houses. The Republicans have a relatively small lead in controlling state houses. And that is where so much of the business of this nation is done. And especially if Congress is going to be gridlocked, if Biden wins and there's a Republican Senate, there's going to be quite a bit of gridlock. If Trump wins and, well, we already have a Democratic House and that's not going anywhere, there's going to be gridlock. It's only if Biden wins and gets both houses that there's not going to be gridlock. So those state houses are where so much of the business of this nation happens. So I would say across the nation in the state houses, get up to speed on all that, because it is really important stuff. And once again, Justin, I have completely neglected your request to repeat the questions. So.
Yeah, I know. Your talents. You don't listen to the producers.
Exactly.
You just do what you want.
Not like a politician.
Yeah, right. So I'm gonna take a brief break from going around the horn and take a question from someone who writes in on the chat, and it's in reference to your experience with the mail-in ballots, which I think is something that we're all sort of. But what are the procedural reasons for strict mail-in ballot considerations? Do not fold at risk of being thrown out. Sign here. Don't sign here. Is this a question of ensuring voter integrity, or is it more of a political decision to sort of raise the bar for getting your vote in and getting it counted?
That is a darn good question, and I can't say I'm an expert on that. I've never really worked in that field, and never, other than the 2000 campaign where you had the hanging chads and all that. But in 2000, there were a lot of people who felt that all these strict rules were really about giving whatever side was in power the power to deny ballots, to strike them down. Because if you really can tell, you know, back then it was hanging chads. If you didn't poke your card all the way through and the chad and the little tiny piece of paper was hanging down, then that wasn't counted in some places. Well, it was clear that the intent of the person was to poke it all the way through and have the little piece of paper fall out. But it was used as an excuse for disqualifying some votes. So, you know, it's all those are made, again, going back to the previous question, the state houses and local politics is where these decisions are made. And local decisions can affect national elections. And so make sure that you're not just focusing on Congress and the presidency and Supreme Court appointments and such. So much of what happens in elections in this country generally happens in states, towns, counties, local elections, school board meetings. That's where a lot of the time, that's where the real action is.
Let's see if there's any action at the Wheeler tent. Dartmouth libertarians are hanging out.
Yes, I was wondering, if violence does break out, where do you expect it to in either scenario?
Well, by the way, he said if violence does break out, look how good I'm being, Justin.
That's good.
If violence does break out, where do I expect it? What is the temperature in that tent, by the way? Hey, Wheeler tent?
Well, it depends on how close you are to the heater. So we moved the table right next to it.
Okay, all right. Well, you look okay. Some of the previous ones looked like they were pretty cold in their tents, so. But libertarians are tough guys, right? So.
Yes, we are.
Yes, exactly. I hate to say things that sound like generalizations, but I mean, what we saw after George Floyd, most of the violence was in major cities. And it was in places like Portland and Washington, D.C. and Houston and other cities. I mean, there was, you know, Detroit. You're going to see it in big cities. I think with Trump, it's not going to be in big cities. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C., and I think that within a mile of my house, I've seen one Trump sign and I've seen 200 Biden signs in Washington, D.C. So if the angry people are the Biden people, it's going to be in cities. If the angry people are Trump people, it's going to be out farther. It's going to be places like Charlottesville, Virginia, wherever they decide to have a march or an event or a protest of some sort. That's my guess, but you know, that's just real uneducated guessing there.
You know, Chip, certainly what has happened thus far is not a good predictor of what will happen, but it seems to me today has gone pretty smoothly in terms of acts of violence that may have been feared to happen over the course of the day. I haven't seen much coverage of major outbreaks.
That's right. There's been almost nothing, but I don't think there will be anything until we have a projection of who's going to win.
Sure, but I'm trying to find good news wherever I can.
Good for you. I try to do that too.
I think we have time to go back to Collis Common Ground, with another question. If you're there, call us Common Ground.
We are here. Hi, Mr. Reid. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming to Dartmouth. My name is Manu, and I had one quick question about mail-in ballots and absentee. So, like you probably already know, a lot of states, as well as nonpartisan organizations, are starting to sue or take a lot of issues to court over the legitimacy of these policies. How do you think that's going to affect recounts, the timing of the election, and even its decision at the end of it?
I don't know. You know, that is awfully speculative. He asked how, with all the trouble and all the questions and challenges to mail-in voting, states and organizations are going to court. I know you've got the ACLU in court on one side and conservative groups on the other side. You've got states in court for different reasons. A lot of those, a lot of the things I've been reading about today with people going to, with groups or states or local governments or parties, the parties going to court are for relatively minor things that get straightened out pretty quickly. I don't think we're going to know what the lawsuits are going to be about, the lawsuits that have any significance are going to be about until we know how close this election is, what the problems are, which states have those problems, and what the laws on mail-in ballots are in those states. So I think it's a great question, but it's probably premature.
Let's go back to the Rockefeller Center to take another question from there.
Mr. Reid, thank you so much for joining us today. I think many of us are wondering about what will happen to the Republican Party if Donald Trump loses. What factions in the Republican Party do you see maneuvering for power in a post-Trump GOP, and who do you see prevailing?
Well, you know, I mentioned that whole thing about if Trump loses, and I mentioned that thing about the family. I find it very hard to believe that, I mean, Trump has a certain magic with the Trump base that I do not see in any of his children. I think if Trump does lose, the Republican Party is in, and especially if the Republicans lose the Senate, I think they're in big trouble for the, certainly for the next couple of years. I don't know what they're going to do, but I think that we've already seen some Republicans peeling off from Trump. If he loses, they're not going to feel that obligation to hang in there for their own political careers to the degree that they do now. You know, certainly the Trump supporters will still be out there, but I think it's going to be a slow process. This is my guess, a slow process of Republicans gradually peeling themselves away from Donald Trump and trying to get the party back to what it used to be. I don't know how successful they're going to be with that because, you know, who knows? What if Trump runs again himself in 4 years? You just never know. I try not to make predictions of that sort because they're always wrong.
Well, and I suppose a related question is what happens to the Republican Party if Trump wins?
Yeah, I think for the most part, steady as she goes. People are certainly not going to abandon him. They're not going to get much done. I mean, could you imagine being a Republican member of the House if Trump wins and the Democrats take the Senate and they have the House and the Senate? Is Trump going to compromise with a Democratic Senate and House? It's hard. It's just hard to imagine what's going to happen. It's hard for me to envision him doing that. But Republicans in Congress are going to have basically nothing to do if they're the minority party and Donald Trump's still the president.
Chip, we have time for one more question before we all start to glue ourselves to our favorite chairs to watch the returns. I'm going to end with this one question that I'd like to pose, and that is, you know, we've talked a lot about sort of the unprecedented things that have happened during this campaign, many of them disturbing, you know, talk of social unrest, actual social unrest, claims of rigged elections and voter suppression. I will say that one very positive thing seems to be engagement You know, we had nearly 100 million voters voting prior to Election Day. We're on track for what will be the largest, I would imagine, presidential vote ever. As you think back on the last couple of months, is there anything that you saw that you took away that gives you a hope for what is coming? Though we don't know the outcome, is there anything that you refer back to that gives you hope for what is to come?
Well, the answer is kind of no, because I hate to say it, but as you were saying that, I was thinking that, yes, sure, it's great that people are engaged, but why are they engaged? Because they're terrified or they're mad as hell. And that's what gets people engaged sometimes. I would like to say it's just their love of public policy and their obligation and duty to vote. But what has gotten people really fired up to vote this time around is fear and anger. So sorry for that pessimistic end to this thing, but
yeah. Well, somehow it seems fitting that we would end a discussion on pretty much anything related to 2020 with the words fear and so thank you for that, Chip. Thank you for staying on brand for 2020. But seriously, that was a fabulous conversation. We really appreciate your time and your insights. And sharing your thoughts with us on this momentous night, this momentous occasion. So thank you for spending time on Dartmouth's campus virtually this election day. And we look forward to having you back here in the flesh, Chip.
It was my pleasure. I love Vermont, New Hampshire and Vermont. I look forward to getting up there sometime.
Thank you very much, Chip.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you, Justin, for ably navigating multiple locations. And Chip, even though you may have ended on a slightly pessimistic note, there was a lot of laughter tonight. So that was a pleasant surprise. It was more laughter than I expected on a momentous evening.
In 2020, yes.
Right, in 2020, during pandemic. Murder hornets. Anyway.
I was going to try to mention the murder hornets.
Look, for some, for my dogs, 2020 is the best year ever. I'm home all the time.
Yeah, right.
2020 rocks. My guy is home all the time.
Well, we don't want to.
There they are.
I'm jealous.
Yes, they're pit bulls, but they're the sweetest dogs in the world.
Well, thank you so much, Chip. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Jason. I want to thank, there's a lot of people behind the scenes for this event. Thank you to all our student partners, all our campus partners. Thank you so much. I expect that most of our audience has someplace else they'd like to be, so I'm going to keep this short, but I did want to mention on Thursday night, we are going to have a post-election analysis, so you can figure out what's going to happen tonight. Professor Mia Costa from the Government Department will be here with 3 scholars from around the country. That will be 5 o'clock on this Thursday night, November the 5th at 5. I hope you come back then. And for any Dartmouth students who are on campus, you can go to call us, the Rockefeller Center, the tents at Qatar Shabazz, Streeter, and Wheeler for some in-person viewing opportunities. Thanks to everyone. Have a great election night. Thank you, Chip.